SEO Show number 20, and thank you for being here. Today we've got an incredible guest lined up for you, and I'm sure it's going to be an absolutely amazing show. We've just had a little pre-chat, and it's some really good stuff to share with you today. First off, though, over to Henrik for the housekeeping.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's show, which will be very interesting. We just want to go through the housekeeping. Can everybody hear us out there? And can everybody see the screen? So just give us a little dot. Doesn't seem so, because nobody answers. So I'll say we just go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, sorry.
Remember out there, please subscribe to our channel. Vincent said, yep, all good. So they can hear and see us. And Vincent, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. And let's hit it.
And I'm sure it must be working because, well, put it this way, it's never not worked, has it? So let's hope that somebody does say hello there. Hello, Vincent. How are you doing? It's great to welcome you aboard today as well. Vincent is one of our friends as well, who has a hosting company over there in France. So I'm really pleased, and a company that we do support in hoststage.com, host-stage.com. So welcome again, Vincent. And today, this is just as exciting as having Vincent on us in the audience. We've got a great guest with us today, a person who probably should be known to everybody, really, that deals with WordPress, because his plugin, if you haven't heard of the man himself, then I'm sure you'll have heard of the plugin. So I want to say a warm welcome to Mr. Frank Goossens. I hope I said that right. The original developer of the Autoptimize and Async JS plugins. Hello, Frank.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me on the show to start with.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. I mean, I'm going to pass over to you just in a few minutes, but I want to big you up a little bit more, if I may. In the waiting room just before we started the show, we was talking, and well, I'll probably let Frank tell you of this, but he told us of a phenomenal sort of achievement that happened just last week with his plugins, and deservedly so. So I'll probably let him tell you that, because that's his big moment. But I mean, the first time, it's only just recently that I reached out to Frank, because somebody told me, and we covered this last week when we was talking about WordPress site speed. Somebody told me I was using Autoptimize, not really knowing that it was Frank's at that moment. I also used Critical CSS. I reached out to the Critical CSS guy for some support. And he passed me over to Frank, who contacted me with some excellent advice. And one of those bits of advice was to use the async JavaScript plugin, which I had seen before, but I'd always steered clear of, because I thought, I don't know what that's going to do to my WordPress site. It sounded a bit too techie for me, so I'd steered clear of it up until that moment. However, using the phenomenal hosting that I told you about last week, where we're getting sort of 1 second loads anyway, I went ahead and installed the async JavaScript onto the computer, pressed the button, and now I saw this wizard, and I was just blown away. I went into the wizard, which we demonstrated last week, if you recall. The wizard worked through. I went back over to the performance, and I was just amazed at how much difference it really made. Even a site that I set up last week that was reporting something like 1.6 seconds, I ran the wizard, and straight away it was down to 0.6 second page load times. I mean, this is just phenomenal. Then that's the free version. Add on top of it Frank's knowledge. So this is one plugin and one person you really need to be listening to when it comes to site speed with WordPress. The guy obviously clearly knows his business. So Frank, I mean, do you want to, are you ready? Are you able to give us a walkthrough of how the plugin works, how you use it on a site, anything like that?
Sure. What I want to do is I have a demo site set up on the hosting platform, and so it's just a standard WordPress, WooCommerce, and I think 2 or 3 other active plugins I'll show you in a minute. And then I'll run that through Google Pagespeed Insights, and we'll see what Google Pagespeed Insights says. We'll go through the recommendations and through some data, and we'll see what is good about Google Pagespeed Insight and which things might be less so. And we'll use the recommendations in there to tweak the site using primarily Autoptimize some of the advanced options in there. So that's what I have in mind for this show, actually. So I will take over the screen if that's okay with you guys.
Yeah, sure, go ahead, please.
Application
window.
window.
Just doing that, Henrik, did anybody actually ever say hello then? Did they comment at all?
Yes, they all say they can hear us loud and clear, and coming from San Jose in California, the strain up in Canada. So they're all here. The gang is here.
Cool. Excellent. Well done. Thank you. I just thought I'd better mention it. I was slightly worried that we was going to do this without an avid audience. There we go. Sorry, Frank. Back over to you.
Okay. Good morning, California, by the way. Early there. Okay. Do you see my screen? You should see page Autoptimize test, WooCommerce shop with some nice little drawings. Is that visible?
I think they can see it because we can see it, Frank. So that's okay. There's a lag. There's a lag out to the audience of up to 60 seconds. Yeah. So.
Okay. So this is a demo site with demo content imported into WooCommerce. Very simple. I have let's zoom in a bit. I have 4 plugins active, being WooCommerce, being a plugin that offers product comparisons in WooCommerce, and the add to any share buttons. In general, when I see sites of customers, because we also do optimization services, most customers have a huge amount of have a lot more plugins than this. So this is this can be considered a very lean setup, but still it's interesting nonetheless. So we have 4 plugins active, the shop page, and then we go to Pagespeed Insights. Let's first and foremost, so we start new, we copy the URL, and we let Pagespeed Insights analyze the shop page, which for your run-of-the-mill shop is more important than the normal content. So this is really what is important. So we have a mobile score and a desktop score. I guess most people have seen Pagespeed Insights scores already. So it's divided in between mobile and desktop score, and it gives you a number. It's a number out of 100, and many people focus on that number. How can I get that as high as possible? Where, as you can see, beneath 50 you're in red, which is really bad. Between 50 and 90 you're in orange, which is okay, and everybody tries to go to 90 or more, and some people swear they won't rest until they reach that magical number of 100. Now, to be very honest with you people, this is one of the things I do not really like about Google Pagespeed Insights, because that number is just a way that Google tries to gamify performance. The Google Pagespeed Insight score as such does not measure your site's performance, because the performance of the site is, in reality, as also discussed on previous shows, measured in numbers of seconds, or better still, milliseconds. This is not that number. This is a way Google tries to quantify the degree in which a site implements performance best practices. So whereas that number is something which is right in your face, it's the first thing you see after having run the test. So we're at 75 mobile, 90 desktop. This is not the performance which is measured, but the degree in which best practices have been implemented. Real performance you can find here. You see here lab data and things like contentful paint, meaningful paint, which is different, speed index, things like those are the real measurements of performance. Why? Because they indeed are expressed in seconds. So that's the second part of the screen. You have the overall score, which, although it can be a way to entice people to act, is to me the least important. Then you have something very important, timings of a number of KPIs, which Google considers important. And then you have a number of opportunities where Google will suggest improvements that could be done, and they even estimate the amount of savings that are possible. Now, obviously, this cannot be correct, but because if you combine all the savings you see here, you would be able to save up until 6-7 seconds, whereas the site is a lot faster than 7 seconds. So you would have a negative time. But it's just an estimation of what can be accomplished when you would serve images in next-gen formats or eliminates render blocking resources, etc., etc. The scores are different between mobile and desktop, and the recommendations can be different as well. So as you can see in desktop, we have only one recommendation, eliminate render blocking resources. The difference is purely based on the fact that on mobile, you have a lot less bandwidth, which means that some of the best practices have bigger impact on mobile due to it being bandwidth restricted. If I'm not mistaken, Google tests on a bandwidth which is approximately 3G. So let's use these results and try to correlate that with what Autoptimize can do and see how making changes in Autoptimize impacts the timings, the opportunities, and in the end, but to me that is not or should not be the main goal, also the actual score. So I already installed Autoptimize, but it's not active yet. So let's activate it. And now we go to the settings. Dismiss this. So main settings on the JavaScript, CSS, and HTML tab are for JavaScript, CSS, HTML, and then a number of miscellaneous options. Main thing here is optimize JavaScript code. We aggregate JavaScript files, which means that all the JavaScript that Autoptimize finds in a page will be combined into one file, which by default will be loaded as late as possible in order to prevent the JavaScript from blocking the rendering, the painting of the page. There's a number of other options we'll just leave as is here. The next block is the CSS options. We will optimize the CSS code and aggregate the CSS files. And for starters, we'll leave these as is as well, but we'll go in here for some further tweaking later on. And all these options can be left as is. So we save our changes. And we will now reanalyze. Let's do that in a second tab. That makes it easier to compare.
What hosting is this, Frank? Is this just on a server or is it cloud?
This is Servbolt, which is a Scandinavian/Dutch company specialized in managed hosting.
Okay.
So this was our original result. Mobile. So if you compare the numbers here, you'll immediately see that the first contentful paint is significantly lower already. Meaningful paint is lower, but not that much yet. So this is just with the default options. What should be clear already, if you compare render blocking resources, so to explain what we're talking about, when a page is loaded in the browser, the faster it is visible, or the faster it becomes visible, the better, because your users see something, whilst seeing a white page can lead to frustration if it takes a long time. So the faster a page is painted, the better. Typically, there are two types of things that can cause the browsers to wait painting the page. That is CSS and JavaScript being loaded. So if we look at the original results, you see that there's a whole lot of CSS files being mentioned as render blocking, and also 3 JavaScript files, as you see here, these three last ones. If we look at the new results and the render blocking resources, we should see that indeed there are but 2 render blocking files left, which is the Google Fonts CSS file and the Autoptimize CSS file. So we'll get to those in a minute. Let's go back to our options screen. And then we will say inline and defer CSS. Now, what does that mean? What we will do here is tell Autoptimize to put the CSS needed to render the page as soon as possible, to put that CSS in the HTML itself, meaning that the full CSS does not have to be downloaded in order for the page to be rendered. So what should we put here? There are different tools out there on the internet which can be used to generate critical CSS. The one you mentioned earlier was, or you mentioned Jonas. Jonas is the guy who created and maintains criticalcss.com. And that's the tool that I generally use to extract critical CSS. And I will do so now for this little page.
Yeah, well, we'll mention to everybody watching that critical CSS itself is a paid service, but it's a fairly low cost really for what it does.
And there are also free alternatives, and those I linked to a number of those in the Autoptimize frequently asked questions. So, but generally, I get better results using this one than using the free alternatives. So it depends. You could even, there are JavaScript-based browser add-ons available, which also try to do the same, which is extracting the specific CSS needed to render the page or a part of the page. So I'll click generate here in the meantime. So this is what this service does. This service fetches the page, which URL I just entered. It takes the HTML and it uses a headless browser, so a browser with no UI, to load the page, and it then checks what CSS is used. And the result of that is copied into my clipboard, and I click paste here. And now I click save changes in an empty cache. So to summarize, we activated InlineDe for CSS, and we paste the critical CSS generated on criticalcss.com. And we will now reanalyze. Then we go down. So we came from originally a first contentful paint of 2.7 seconds and meaningful 3.9. We are now at 1.2. Contentful, meaningful is the same for now. Is there anything render blocking left? Let's, here we are. It doesn't mention it, but we saw just now that we also had the Google fonts, which were still render blocking. Don't know why it doesn't mention that here now. But let's show you how you can change that. So Autoptimize has a number of tabs in the top corner here. If you go to Extra, there are miscellaneous options, different options, which you can use to change the way Google fonts are loaded. So what I generally use is the option combine and preload the Google fonts in head, which means that Autoptimize will try to extract all requests for Google fonts, combine them in one request, and load that CSS in a way that is not render blocking. So we will save changes. Reanalyze and see if there's a difference. So it still doesn't mention anything render blocking, which should now indeed not be the case anymore. Contentful paint is indeed a lot better than what we had before, but there's still work to be done. Because if you look at the other opportunities, there are 3 about images. And the last couple of releases of Autoptimize, I have spent a lot of time working on just that, on how can Autoptimize help improving the performance linked to images. For that, there is the Images tab. And by default, there are 2 options, which is Optimize Images. This is an integration with third-party service from the guys from ShortPixel. And it integrates the ShortPixel image optimization CDN into Autoptimize. This is free to start with, but if you pass a certain threshold, you will have to buy credits at ShortPixel to be able to do so. But in this context, this is just a free version. You click Optimize Images. Image optimization quality we leave as is. We will not activate these changes just yet. We will start with this. We will reanalyze and see what changes. That type of iterative work where you make changes and you check the impact is what I usually recommend. It's kind of trial and error. Sometimes you will see, no, this is not the right path. We have to do things differently, but always make changes and test, and try to make changes in one plugin. Don't do work in multiple, because there's a lot of optimizations plugin out there. A lot of them very good. Some work very well together, some don't. So try to work iteratively, one plugin at a time. Always test in between each iteration to make sure that everything works functionally and that indeed the performance improves. So we started out with 75 page speed score, 2.7 contentful paint, speed index 4.6, and we are now at a slightly higher page speed score. But more importantly, you see they use the same color codes here as well. So we are now at 3 green timing-based KPIs, whereas we only had 1 when we started. So we're going the right direction. And if you go down, then let's close this one. We started out with a potential saving of 1.5 seconds for the efficient encoding of images. That went down to 0.45 seconds. And indeed, the number of images mentioned there is a lot less. So indeed, if you compare, and that's also important, I get people asking me, my Google PageSpeed score isn't good. What did I do wrong? In general, to be able to help people, they need to provide me with these kind of details. Don't tell me my score doesn't go up enough, but tell me when you compare the result of a page with and without Autoptimize, what are the different recommendations? What amount of files are mentioned? What files are mentioned? Where are they hosted, etc., etc. So we indeed see in the more recent page speed tests that only 2 files are mentioned as I should look here. So there's less files mentioned that can be better optimized. So let's go back to Autoptimize, and what other options do we have? We have 2 options. I will activate both of them. One is to lazy load images. What does that mean? If you have a page with a lot of images, the shop page has, I think, 20 or something, those images slow the page load itself somewhat down. So what lazy loading does is trying in a more or less automated manner to decide which images should be shown immediately and which ones can be loaded a little later. That's what lazy loading does. And Autoptimize integrated an existing JavaScript solution for that called lazy sizes, which is used by other plugins as well. It's one of the more standard ways of doing lazy loading. And then second option we ticked here is load WebP in supported browsers. What's that about? Well, by default, your images are generally JPEGs, sometimes a PNG, or who knows, even a GIF file. But as Google also mentions on their GSPI result page, serve images in next-gen formats. And so there are a number of next-gen formats. If I'm not mistaken, JPEG 2000 is Apple, JPEG XR is Microsoft, and WebP is by origin Google, but is in the meantime implemented by most other browsers, which is not the case for JPEG XR or 2000. So let's see, we tick those 2 options, lazy load and WebP. We'll save changes. and we rerun the test, and we see what happens. So the only opportunity that is mentioned now is remove unused CSS. We'll talk about that in a second. But indeed, little by little, we are getting closer to having a optimized site. Let's see what other options we can change here. These are small things. This does not have a big impact, but still, while we're at it, we can just take those. Something, as mentioned here, this is for advanced users, but it can be pretty interesting. If you look at the page source here, then you'll see that the add to any, and that's the reason why I added it, that the add to any plugin does a request for their JavaScript. And that is something that is that a lot of plugins do. They fetch JavaScript or CSS sometimes from other resources. For each new domain a browser has to connect to, the connection has to be made. The HTTPS negotiation between the browser and the server has to be done. That is setting up the encryption. And then the request can be sent. So typically, the initial connection on a network level and the negotiation of the encrypted channel HTTPS between the browser and the third-party sites can be optimized by adding that third-party site domain here in the pre-connect. No, that's wrong. Let's copy paste again. Copy paste. So what this does is Autoptimize will add a directive in the HTML source of the pages, which tells browsers to immediately set up a connection with this domain. And we save changes. And let's see what other. We will take aggregate inline CSS, which means that a CSS in general can be either a file which is linked to in the HTML, or it can be put inside the HTML. When you activate this option, Autoptimize will extract that as well. And then we have generate data URIs for images. This is for small background images that are used on pages. These can be, instead of having to fetch them separately, Autoptimize can add them in the CSS itself. Okay, we'll save changes. And we analyze. So let's talk about this one. This is an interesting one as well. And this is rather new. So most WordPress themes and even plugins add requests for Google Fonts. And as we said earlier, Autoptimize has an option to optimize those here under Extra. So this is active. Now, what is new is that I think 2 weeks ago, Google announced that for Google Fonts, they now support a new directive for font declarations in CSS, which is called Font Display, and which essentially tells browsers how to act on fonts being requested. Possibilities to put it in a simple manner, wait to show the page until the font is downloaded, or render the page with a local font and then apply the Google font afterwards. So there are more choices than this. There are, I think, 4 or 5 options there, but generally speaking, that's the idea behind it. So Autoptimize, this version does not have out-of-the-box support for font display yet, but there is a small workaround which I describe on my own blog, and we'll implement that on this side now as well. The way I do that and the way I often tell people to do so is using the Code Snippets plugin. The Code Snippets plugin is a very simple but powerful WordPress plugin that allows you to add PHP code to your site in a way which is not as intrusive and sometimes risky than doing it in your functions.php file. Moreover, if your teams get updated, your functions.php file is overwritten. So I am very fond of code snippets. So Autoptimize has a lot of filters and hooks which can be used to alter the way Autoptimize works. And I created one to do just what we talked about a minute ago, is to tell browsers they can render the page without the fonts having been downloaded already. And that is what this code snippet does. And while we're at it, I have a second code snippet here as well, and I'll show you here. So this is just one line of code which hooks into Autoptimize to tell it not to load LQIP images. What are we talking about here? Sounds gibberish. LQIP stands for low quality image placeholder and is what Autoptimize by default uses when lazy loading images. And a low quality image placeholder is generated automatically on the fly by ShortPixel and is a very low quality version of your image as a placeholder until the real image is loaded. Now, obviously, those are extra requests. And in some cases, it can be worth it not to load those low quality image placeholders. So that's what this code snippet does. So we have 2 of them. One to alter the way fonts are used, and one to alter the way lazy loading works. So we go back to our test and we reanalyze. So what we still have here is reduce server response time. And that's interesting because that allows me to stress the fact that Autoptimize does not do page caching. And that indeed in general, I advise people to either use the page caching that is offered by their hosters. Some hosters indeed do offer page caching solutions, being Varnish or Nginx or other solutions, or people could install a page caching plugin. There are a lot of those out there. I have myself very good experience with WP Supercache or with KeyCDN Cache Enabler, things like that. There are a lot of them out there. Pick your own favorite. But what we can do here, because Servbolt does have an option to enable page caching, which I'll enable here. Static files and full page cache. Save settings. And then we'll do our Pagespeed Insight test again.
If anybody's got any questions out there, they probably could drop them into the chat now, because I know that Frank needs to nip off fairly sharpish once this is finished. So
True.
Yeah. So if there are any there, get them in now, because we'll just have a couple of minutes to run through those.
So here we are. We started out with a PageSpeed score of 75 mobile, 90 desktop, and we are now at 93 mobile and 99 desktop. Again, scores are just a way to quantify the amount of the degree in which best practices are followed. But still, indeed, if you look at the numbers themselves, the timings, the KPIs, which are more important, clearly, then we have improved significantly. So that's what we can do with Pagespeed Insights and Autoptimize. Maybe one last remark. In general, I use other tools to measure performance, but they are somewhat less user-friendly. But I'm a big fan of webpagetest.org, which is a much more technical approach to performance testing. So, are there any questions?
Yeah, and it might be worth, if we could drop your blog somewhere there. I don't know whether you're able to drop the URL to your blog.
Sure.
Or just
Here we are.
And Henrik, have you got any questions there at all?
I have got one myself. So going through this process, Frank, I understand that you have to understand the different phases of this in order to understand how your page load, where the problems could lay. But could you say that the end result that you are come with now could be your initial settings?
Although some of those settings could be considered as generic, in reality, our experience when doing performance optimization for other people is that there is not one set of options which is valid for everyone. There are a lot of things which require testing and tweaking to make sure that it always works correctly. What I had to do, for example, and which I didn't mention, but I indeed should, is if you look at settings, Autoptimize, images lazy load, here, I had to add an exclusion to lazy load to make sure that the images in the product comparison still worked.
Yeah.
So typically, so here you see an image. If I remove that exclusion, then it doesn't work anymore. The same goes for in the JavaScript CSS tab. There are a number of exclusions that you can set there as well. These are the default ones, but in a number of cases, you will have to tweak those to fix issues when Autoptimize is active. So yes, there are a number of options which are more or less default, but one always needs to test and often need to tweak left and right in order for everything to work as smoothly as possible.
Yeah, but that was actually why I asked, because you could be inclined to just go in and take off all those boxes and then say, okay, I'll get the best here. But the step should, the recipe should be start with what you showed originally, go step by step, test the damn thing.
Always test. Yeah.
And then you can end up with one that's load extremely fast.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and if you're like me, for many years I used to just install the plugin, press go, and walk away, without changing anything. Thinking, well, that will make the difference, and of course it does. But we've just seen now that if you actually go in and just work your way through, it actually makes a massive difference.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. So that's really good. Are there any questions from out in the audience?
No, not particularly. Dwayne says, good stuff so far. We'll be playing with this later to test on a few stubborn sites. So yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, it'd be good to hear how people get on. I mean, I'd like to hear of everybody's sub 2 second experiences. Definitely. Yeah. I mean, there's no reason why people shouldn't be achieving that, I guess, now. I do think that it boils down to other factors as well, like we've said about the server and about the server-side caching and so on and so forth. CDN, if you get it there. But, you've seen firsthand how just that tweak in there with that one free plugin that Frank didn't say actually, but it's just gone over 1 million installations in WordPress. And I mean, to achieve 1 million is just phenomenal success, isn't it? I mean, there's not many plugins that go over 1 million, that's for sure. You could definitely fit them on one page. So well done there. But look, Frank, I know you've got to dash off, I think. So, I mean, I want to thank you really for coming on and explaining the use of that. And I'm sure they could reach out, could they? Yeah, go on, sorry.
Yeah, there's just one from a question from Robert says, are there any settings in a case plugin that you don't want to set just if you're using Autoptimize?
Sorry, in what type of plugin?
Are there any settings in a caching plugin that you don't want to set if you are using?
Some caching plugins do have CSS and JavaScript minifications options as well. And I would advise against using 2 plugins to do the same thing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it breaks horrendously. So in general, when using something like WP Fasted Cache or W3 Total Cache, those are good plugins. They do a great job at page caching, but if you want to use them together with Autoptimize, you should disable the JavaScript and CSS minification features in the page cache plugins.
And the thing we mentioned last week about the critical CSS as well, if you do use the critical CSS service, of course, it doesn't just do it the once and then walk away and leave you in case you make any changes. It's constantly monitoring, isn't it?
Yeah,
and adapting to any changes that you make. So no, that's really good. Henrik?
There's a few comments saying, great show, guys. Thanks for sharing your knowledge, very helpful. And once again, hopefully everybody is pleased out there. And we thank you for joining the show. And I think that's all from now.
Okay.
So, Frank, thank you very much for being here on the show. We appreciate it very much. And we will drop some links below in the general comment section about your blog and the recommendations that you have made. And Tony, any last? Remember to subscribe to our channel if you haven't done it so far.
Yeah, no, I'm fine. It's been a great show. Again, thanks to Frank. You know, if you do get really bogged down and really stuck, you know, just do try and reach out to Frank by through his blog, whatever. I mean, he's really obviously he's shown you today. He's there and he wants to support the plugin as much as possible, and really wants the best for all of its users. So, which is commendable. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. Have a nice day.
And you. Bye-bye.
Bye.